my secret, just do something that ain't nobody ever done before, but make it sound like something that's always been there forever.
Hello, welcome to This Filipino American Life, a podcast that explores the nuanced experiences of Filipinos in the United States at Iba Pa. This is your host, Producer Mike, and just Producer Mike, so no air horns there, sorry. So one of the recurring themes on our show has been this idea of community, and what does that look like for folks, for the very different folks that have been on our show these last couple of years. What does your Filipino American community look like? What is your Filipino American experience? And, you know, in a place as big as Los Angeles, which has more Filipinos than a lot of states do, when you ask somebody about the Filipino American community here, you're really asking about a lot of different Filipino American communities. Elena and I happen to live in historic Filipino town, which is one of those communities, but depending on who you talk to and who you ask, they might tell you a story about what it's like in the city of Glendale, which is to the north of here, or in the South Bay of Los Angeles, in a place like Carson, which is to the south of here, or even a place like San Fernando Valley, which is where Elaine and Joe are from. You know, all different places, all different concentrations of Filipinos, different reasons why they're even there, and different things that define those communities. And so, you know, when I think about the Filipino American community as I've experienced it here in Los Angeles, the first place that I think of is a neighborhood called Little Tokyo. Now, for those of you not familiar with Los Angeles, Little Tokyo is a neighborhood in the northeast corner of downtown Los Angeles. It's about a 5-10 minute drive from where Elena and I live now in historic Filipino town. But at least for me, in terms of really kind of understanding and engaging with the Filipino American community here, Little Tokyo was really kind of that gateway, that nexus, that central point at which a lot of things were coming together. And that has been the story of Little Tokyo for many years, for decades. And it continues to be the story today. And one of the things that really fascinates me about Little Tokyo is this idea that, you know, while we have a historic Filipino town, while we have these other communities in Glendale, Carson, the San Fernando Valley, etc., for some reason or another, you know, Little Tokyo has been the home for a lot of Filipinos, a place where a lot of us have come together, have met each other even, have, you know, taken on leadership roles, you know, created art, created spaces for art to even exist, you know, in a way and on a scale that I think is really significant. So the conversations that we're going to have in this episode are really going to explore that idea. We talked to Allison Dela Cruz, who's the Vice President of Programs at the Japanese American Cultural and Community Center. We're going to talk with Kennedy Cabasares, who is an artist and resident of Little Tokyo, a longtime resident, and have a conversation with Francis Collado, who is the Executive Director of Visual Communications, which puts on the annual Los Angeles Asian Pacific Film Festival. And what we're going to explore is really, you know, what brought them to the neighborhood of Little Tokyo, why Little Tokyo is significant for them, and, you know, what is that connection between Little Tokyo and the larger Filipino American community in Los Angeles. And so I'm not going to get into too much detail. I'll let the conversations really kind of cover that. And really, there were a lot of other folks that I really wanted to talk to really kind of explore this idea. And, you know, maybe we'll save that for a future episode. But for now, just sit back, relax, and enjoy. We are here in Little Tokyo, sitting down with one of our dearest friends, friend of the podcast, but also friend for life, Allison Dela Cruz. Just to kind of hear about, you know, her story and her connection to this community. So why don't you go ahead and introduce yourself, Allison?
Hi, I'm Allison Dela Cruz. I'm an artist and a cultural organizer, administrator, all-around storyteller who has lived in Little Tokyo, worked in Little Tokyo, created and made work here, and been a fan and kind of walk-around resident of Little Tokyo for almost 20 years now.
20 years. So let's go back to 20 years ago then. I mean, what first brought you to Little Tokyo? You're not originally from Los Angeles, right? You're from...
Oh no, I was born and raised in Van Nuys. I was born in Van Nuys and I was raised in and around LA. We lived in Walnut for a good portion of the early 80s, and then in the mid 80s we moved to, like late mid 80s, we moved to Torrance. I got bused to a school in Gardena, which is where I met my first really large community of Japanese Americans. And as a mixed Filipino, my dad's Filipino, he came here, in '69, met my mom, who's white, from Ohio in early 70s. I'm the eldest of three, and by the time we got to Torrance, I had not been around a lot of Filipinos, so in Gardena there were a couple. But really, I was in Filipino-landia, as we would call it, when we moved to Carson. And I ended up going to school in Carson and then graduating from Carson High.
Sea house?
Sea house?
Sea house.
Can I get a sea house? I think the first time I came to Little Tokyo was probably in the mid-90s when I was in the hula community. I was dancing hula with Auntie Clarice Vahina Li'i Nuhi with her Hello, and we came and performed here at the Japanese American Cultural and Community Center at JACCC. We also performed across the street from where JACCC is. There's a bunch of apartments there now, but at the time it used to be a giant parking lot, and the Tofu Festival used to happen there.
R.I.P. Tofu Festival.
So there are photos of me in Hello, where doing a kahiko, or pictures of me on stage, I think at Tofu Festival. And then I started working with the Festival of Filipino Arts and Culture in the late 90s, so 99 was my first festival where I officially had a role. And then in the early 2000s, when Linda Mobalit was still at Visual Communications, she asked me to create an original piece for a fundraiser they were doing here. But even before that, in '99, I premiered my one-woman show, Sungka, down in Carson at Cal State Dominguez Hills. And Brian Yamami, who is the artistic director of Taiko Project, worked here at JACCC at the time. And he saw my show, and he's like, hey, we're doing this thing called Fresh Tracks. So in the spring of 2000, JACCC produced the Fresh Tracks series with people like Kennedy Cabasares, Tracy Kato Kiriyama, Edrin Sumogaisai, Aaron O'Brien was in that thing. I think Christina Wong was in the UCLA theater group that was in that show, that series. And they produced us actually at the David Henry Wong Theater, which a lot of people know as East West Players. So in 2000, JACCC produced my solo show. We were doing an 8 o'clock show, we sold out, and they allowed me to do a second show at 10 o'clock. So my solo career really got a lot of push and love from JACCC at the time. And from that, I was able to tour the show. I'd been coming to Tuesday Night Cafe. I'd taken writing classes here in Little Tokyo. East West Players' offices used to be located on the 5th floor of JACCC. Irene Soriano used to run poetry events at the Japanese American National Museum when it was in its original building, which is the old Nishi building.
Yeah.
So a lot of my artistic history is connected to JACCC, Little Tokyo, East West Players, Janam, Tuesday Night Cafe, as well as other spaces in LA. But I would say, I tell people that, Little Tokyo has really been a really important artistic incubation place for me.
Mm-hmm. And for those of you who are not familiar with Little Tokyo and kind of the cultural institutions that Allison has laid out, all of these are basically within a 2-3 block radius of where we're sitting right now, in Little Tokyo. And I myself too have been to a lot of those spaces, participating in those spaces. Tuesday Night Cafe was also home for me, where I was helping with things like photography and DJing and et cetera. But on all the names that you listed too, it was a lot of like Asian Americans coming from all over, really kind of connecting with this neighborhood. Why do you think that is? Are there other cultural institutions, that people have also kind of featured Asian American art, or is there maybe like a singularness to this space?
I think there's a lot of reasons. I think certainly living in Los Angeles, living in Southern California, we have a lot of the kind of landmark populations where people will say, like, we have the largest population of Samoans outside of Western Samoa. Mm-hmm. We have the largest population of,
Koreans outside of Korea.
Yeah. I'm not up on our current Filipino numbers, but if we're not number one, then we're certainly only number two in statistical number of Filipinos to the Bay Area. Well, in my heart, we are better than the Bay. I love you, Bay. But But I think Little Tokyo is, and then as somebody, I lived and worked in historic Filipino town as well. And I think just having lived in different API enclaves in and around LA County, I think what I've discovered even more so now in the last 4 years that I've been working in Little Tokyo, there's a unique kind of vortex to the history of this place and the fact that, at one time Little Tokyo used to stretch from the 101 freeway all the way down to Olympic, all the way west to Los Angeles, all the way to the LA River. And so because of these historic waves of displacement and gentrification, and not just from like developers, but literally like eminent domain from the city. Like, when the old Parker Center and what is now the 911 call center, that block all used to be housing in Little Tokyo. It used to be important legacy businesses in Little Tokyo.
Oh wow!
And so there's so many layers to Little Tokyo. I think that there's a mix of Little Tokyo was already being loved and protected as much as possible by the Japanese Americans who were here. I think as a producer and an administrator and a cultural geek of sorts, I realized, having had to produce work all over LA County, in terms of API communities, the Japanese and Japanese American community have a really unique relationship with with folks who are from Japan as well as Japanese companies. And I think a lot of that's connected to, Japanese American incarceration in World War II. But I also think it's related to the way in which economically, I was talking to some friends about this the other day, like, the relationship between Japanese Americans and Japan and the way that Japan sends money in or out is so different from the way Filipino Americans relate to the Philippines. As Filipinos, our model is we send all our money to the Philippines. We spend what we can here, we get all the good deals, we send it back.
Yes.
Whereas I think for Nikkei folks, which is the term, like we would call ourselves Pinoy Pinay, like the general term for Japanese Americans is Nikkei. I think for Nikkei folks, because Japan has a different economic engine in reality, they're used to creating these different relationships. So there's philanthropy that kind of goes back and forth. It's not super huge, but it's there. And then there's, I think, a lot of cultural investment from Japan to try to deal with the legacies of their past. I think certainly for Japanese Americans, there's been a recovery of economic realities post-World War II. And I think there's a dynamic in terms of the generations of Nikkeis who are here where there still is money in the community, although I know that the community is starting to look at its philanthropy dollars in really interesting new ways. And so I think like Little Tokyo is kind of that perfect intersection. We're the second oldest neighborhood in Los Angeles after Pueblo or Olvera Street,
which is not that far from here. It's basically on the other side of the 101 freeway from us.
And so I think, Little Tokyo being the second oldest, Little Tokyo also has a deep history of African American, and then, really we should say the very first peoples and all of these places where the Tongva, they're still here. So Little Tokyo also was part of a lot of Southern California. It was citrus farms. So there's, I think, 4 trees in Little Tokyo right now that are over 100 years old.
Wow. Really?
3 of them are citrus trees.
Where are these trees?
So one of them, the non-citrus that I know about, is the Oyama tree, which is in between what we call Lot 7, so behind First Street, behind East West Players and Visual Communications, kind of that open parking lot between Mocha, Janum.
That one tree that they threatened to demolish when they were like going to redo the parking lot, and people like protested to keep the tree there.
Yes. And at different times of year, if you walk by that tree, it's kind of, the droppings are intense, and it's kind of nasty, But that tree's been there a really long time. Yeah. So that's the non-citrus tree that I know about. The 3 citrus trees I know about, one of them's here in the JCCC Plaza. It's a grapefruit tree. The botanists have come and collected the seeds. They say it's descended from the Valencia orange family. Its sibling tree is behind the San Pedro Fern building, actually right next to the steps near Visual Communications. If you walk up past the VC office door and you go up one more level to the smoker's corner, you can see into the backyard. Actually, the building where Kennedy lives, they have an original grapefruit tree there, and I think there's one other citrus tree there.
That's awesome.
So we're citrus farms. Little Tokyo and JCCC in particular is also part of the legacy of Biddy Mason, who's an African American woman who was able to liberate herself from slavery. She was a midwife. She amassed a fortune. She was the very first African American woman and philanthropist, landowner. And then the other part of this history of this land, before it gets to the Nikkei community, is that in the early 1900s, the Azusa Street Mission, or the birthplace of the Pentecostal faith, literally happened on the land here in Little Tokyo. Yeah. Some of it actually happened on Bonnie Brae. I've been
in historic Filipino town.
So I've been invited to think about collaborating on a project, and I was reading some materials on it, and they kept talking about the Bonnie Brae house, and all I could think about was historic Filipino town.
No, there's a plaque outside the Bonnie Brae house.
Yeah. So Azusa Street, the Pentecostal faith, you know, for folks of that faith, they say there are 3 major Christian sacred spaces in the world: the Wailing Wall, the Vatican, and Azusa Street. And so in the context of the mix that was happening, Azusa Street, from the materials I've been reading with these partners, is it was known because it was about allowing people of multiple racial groups to participate in the faith. And then you kind of fast forward to, I think the church had to move, and so we get to a point where during Japanese American incarceration in World War II, a lot of African Americans were able to move in and rent property, own businesses here.
And it was called Bronzeville at the time. And I worked on a project called Bronzeville Street Jazz. I think that's what it was called. It was a VR fulfillment project, and it was a projection mapping that happened in the space in JACCC. And the artists behind it are the Form Follows Function folks. So Maya Santos, Isil Borlasa, myself, and several other, in collaboration with Visual Communications, put that together. And so it's really interesting, like, this space, Little Tokyo, it has such an overlap and intersectionality of various communities of color. And yet when you hear Little Tokyo, like, you're gonna immediately jump to like Japanese and Japanese Americans.
Yeah, and I was just gonna say, like, I mean, the reason I even thought of this as like a good topic of discussion is because when I think of Little Tokyo, I don't think of just the JA community and its institutions, but that, and as I was referencing earlier, like that this has been kind of a cultural nexus for a lot of folks. And also, as you referenced earlier, kind of a lot of history of migration and displacement, but also, you know, again, a little bit geography if you're not familiar with the area. You know, we are near Olvera Street, which is the oldest neighborhood in Los Angeles, but that's also right next to Union Station, which is like it was the main entry point for a lot of folks in the early days of this city. And a lot of the migration that's happened in the history of Los Angeles kind of started off kind of in these transit kind of spaces, and kind of just kind of, you know, blossomed outwards, but also like people were getting pushed outwards as well.
And if you read like Carlos Boulos on American is in the Heart, like the locations for the story are in this neighborhood. Like if you walk these streets, there's a part like in California or something like near Weller Court, there's this old hotel that has a flower shop on the bottom. That was a Little Manila neighborhood, that like one block, and like old Manongs used to live in that hotel. Like it's the rumor is that Carlos Bolosan like stayed there too. So I can't confirm or deny it. I'm not a historian. Joe might be able to speak more about it, but I know that like that corner is significant to our community, and it's just interesting that like we're still here.
And I mean, and as you referenced earlier, I mean, the connections to historic Filipino town, which you were once a resident of, me and Elaine are currently residents of. You know, and I used, you know, we all had some kind of like also professional connection to the area through, you know, Search and Involve Filipino Americans, Film Arts, and all these other kind of spaces. And I mean, as you were describing earlier about, you know, the way that the Japanese American community has been able to engage and kind of bring in investment and, you know, into both cultural and kind of like financial, you know, being able to build this community, in other words, you know, so, you know, that kind of maybe explains why historic Filipino town doesn't have the same, but I mean, also, you know, I mean, are there spaces in historic Filipino town and in the Filipino community at this level, you know, that you've encountered in at least LA, you know?
And, you know, as I hear you say that, it also makes me think about Little Tokyo is old enough to be a part of the history of LA, where there was very clear lines and red lines around where people were allowed to live. And so I think people congregated here not just as a matter of function, and a lot of the way that JA community names itself in the early days is like Ise, Nisei, Sansei, Yonsei, so like first, second, third generation, fourth generation. A lot of folks in those early migrations are from a particular region in Japan, and a lot of those families are all from like Fukuoka or Hiroshima or Nagasaki or Kumamoto. So there are there are regional reasons. It's almost like there's a lot of Ilocanos in Hawaii versus like there's a lot more Tagalogs in LA. And not to say that there's not Ilocanos and Cebuanos and everybody.
Exactly.
But to say like if we think about regional migration among Filipinos, and I think that's what for me is like it kind of makes me. And the way in which the Japanese American community is dealing with the new immigrants and the mixed immigrants of people who've been here a long time versus people who've just gotten here. Like for me as a Filipino American, particularly as a multiracial person, it's like, it doesn't make me trip at all. I'm like, oh, you're just like us, you're diasporic. Like I get it. Like at a certain level, I'm like, oh, we're islander archipelago people. We're diasporic, and there are Filipinos who've been in the United States, like the New Orleans aunties that we see in Renee Tajima Peña's film. And then there are folks who are just getting here. So,
and the film you're talking about, Renee Tajima Peña, it's a classic Asian American studies film called Honk
If You Love Buddha.
Honk If You Love Buddha. Honk If You Love Buddha.
Yeah, and she goes to New Orleans and meet these freaking
ninth generation
Pinays who are like, we're white. And it just, for me personally, I'm like, no, you are, but you're really not. But like, as a person who grew up having people always be like, what are you? And and then just, when I got to Carson, it was the first time I was around other Filipino kids, and they were like, you're not Filipino enough because you don't look like us, you don't speak our language, you don't know what the food is. And I came to this point, which really I think, to connect it to Little Tokyo was a place where I was able to make art. I was able to literally put my story on stage in Little Tokyo, and I used the sungka board as my series of metaphors and as a way to really claim my own space and my own belonging to our community. And I think that the magic of Little Tokyo is, as Andy Lowe at East West Players likes to say, it's the Asian American, it's like the nexus place. It's I forget the way he phrases it, but it's like the hometown of Asian American creation, because so many different. We look at, I know when you talk to Francis from VC, when you talk to Kennedy, when you look at East West Players, like John Briones and Joan Amadea and
these people who have gone on to like amazing things, a lot of folks have gotten their start here. So my relationship with Allison is that I knew her brother Tony De La Cruz from college, who is currently a coach player or something in the PBA, and Allison would come and do workshops or performances for the HAPA organization at Irvine, and I was about to graduate, and I would look at Allison and be like, hey, hi. Like, I look at her as like an ate figure, and I'd be like, I want to move back to LA, and I want to like get involved with the community. And she remembered that, and years later, she tapped me and be like, hey, you're here. Would you ever think about being the tickets coordinator for the Festival of Philippine Arts and Culture? And I was like, I worked at a movie theater, sure. I guess I know how to run tickets. And that was my introduction and mentorship into really like Filipino American community organizing. And so you did that for me, and you mentioned that Linda Mabala asked you to do the work. And can you like share a bit about Linda, because she's with us in spirit, and we mentioned her name, and I feel like a little like kawawa in that like I don't know if I ever met her in person, because I think by the time I had come into the community, she had already passed.
Yeah, I had been involved in FPAC, Festival of Philippine Arts and Culture, and actually Jerome Academia was working at VC under Linda, who was executive director, and she had given Jerome some of his work time was allowed to help us nurture FPAC. And so I got to know Linda through FPAC. She saw me as this, she called a lot of us young bloods. So, and she used to live in Hi-Fi. Like, I think at the time she lived in Hi-Fi. And so, and I always knew her as this like badass, laid back, but very crisp, sharp code switching auntie, because she could go from like, yeah, I grew up in a farming community, I'm whatever, I live down the street from C, but what are you guys doing? She would like go like that, and then she would get into a meeting and be like, all right, we need to address these things. So I think she was a role model to me in terms of her ability to come with her authenticity in a way that always brought us into the room, but make it very clear to people when she had to, she was not going to be stepped on. And so I met her through FPAC. They were getting ready to do an anniversary for visual communications. She was trying to put together something different. And she's like, hey, they tell me you're a poet. You're a poet, right? I was like, yeah, I do spoken word. She's like, okay, good, yeah, I want to pair you with this group, East LA Taiko. You're going to do a thing, okay? And we're going to do a show. It's going to be at the Aratani. I was like, I don't know where that is. She's like, yeah, we'll send you stuff. So I knew this thing was coming, and I get to the Aratani Theater, which I now, in my job, oversee, which all the things being circular. And I was paired with Maseo, who runs East LA Taiko, and I had gotten their 4-CD track, and I found a track that I really loved. And I had heard that Flower Drum Song was being revised by David Henry Wong. He was calling it a revisical. And he was gonna reclaim Flower Drum Song and rewrite it so it wasn't so racist. And I was trying to figure out what to do, and I knew what VC did, and so I heard this one song on their CD, and I started to write this piece. And I had most of it when I showed up for tech. I think we had tech at like 2, and the show was at 8. So I had to practice. I had only met the drummers like that day. It was one of those kind of collabs. And he's like, well, we're just gonna follow you. So we vibed on it and we did it. And after the sound check, he was like, oh, that's dope. So I think we figured out how to end it. I was like, yeah, I gotta clean it up. And the parking lots were still across the street. And I went into so before I left, Linda was like, that's good. She's like, just, clean it. I was like, okay. So I went in my car and I sat in my car in the parking lot and I practiced and I rewrote it and I memorized it. And we did the show and it went, and I was like, why do we gotta do it again? Why can't we write our own musical? And I was like going off about Flower Drum Song. And in the middle of performing, I looked down and Nancy Kwan was sitting in the house.
Oh my God.
And I was like, oh, wow, okay. Wow, Nangs, okay.
Oh my God.
And I'll never forget. And John Cho, he had a rock band called Left of Zed, and they were in the show. And I knew John and I had been in writing classes together, so I was like, oh, I have friends in the show, like, cool. And John and Mako were actually collaborating on a kind of punk rock version of My Way.
Oh my God.
So I'm on stage and I'm doing my thing. I just gotta throw it down. And I'm, young and I don't know. And people are clapping. They were about it. I get off stage and I go into the Aratani green room, and I'll never forget Mako standing there. He's like, yeah, fuck those guys. That was great. He's like, why we gotta do the old shit? I mean, Mako was like going off, and I was just like, oh, Mako's amazing. He's one of the founders of East West Players, and then a lot of really important films, and he was so, a complex man himself.
Yeah.
And so Linda really kind of, not only with FPAC, but artistically, what she told me later, she's like, you're fast. She's like, that's really great, you're fast. She's like, you gotta just make stuff. She's like, be fast. And so, I would definitely say like who I am as an artist has deeply been informed by those moments, because it helped me to understand like, yeah, it's not about, I think my early work was like, I need a space, whereas like in that moment it was like, it's not about, it's about like put it down, like show up, like don't be afraid. And even if people don't like it, that's fine. So, we finished the show and everybody came out into the plaza, and I met Sandra Oh that night, and I was like, oh my God, you're so amazing. And she was like, that was so great.
Oh my gosh.
And then, no, totally. I told her that years later when we met again. I was like, I met you when I was 20. Well, I wasn't 20, but I was in my 20s. But somebody came up to me, they're like, Nancy Kwan wants to meet you.
Oh no.
And so I was like, oh my God. So I went up to her, I was like, I'm so sorry. She was like, no, that was good. And I don't remember any more of that conversation.
I wouldn't either, because if Nancy Kwan talked to me, I'd be like, holy shit, you're Susie, like Wong from the movie The World of Susie Wong. Holy shit, you were the OG Flower Drum Song. Oh my God, are fanning me right now? Like, wow.
I enjoy being a girl. Like, oh my God. So VC, I think, was one of those really, and Linda really, I think, and then Linda brought me into a project called Grassroots Rising that she was producing. It was her last project that we actually had to finish after she passed away. And Linda was one of a series of elders that I would meet who I felt like I knew that they were important. I knew that they were somebody I needed to pay attention to. And then within a certain, 5 to 7 year period, they were gone. And so I think that it was Linda's passing that actually made me, because here at JACCC, one of our early important folks is Dwayne Ibada, and I had met him. He was, I think, our performing arts director of the theater, and he was super critical to the life of the Aratani and JACCC, in addition to all of the other folks in our history. And Jerome Academia took me to breakfast in Gardena, which is about 15 miles south of here, to Brudda's. And no, we were at Bob's Okazuya, which is now in a new place. And Dwayne was already there having breakfast, and Jerome was mentoring me about FPAC. And Dwayne came up and said hi to us, and then he was leaving. And when we got up to pay our meal, Dwayne had already bought it.
Oh my God.
And then Dwayne passed away shortly after that. So, you have the passing of Dwayne, you have the passing of Linda. And so I think there were just, and then there were people like Peter Corpus and Ernie Pena and Papo de Assis and, just all these like...
Peter was the development director at Search Involved Filipino Americans. Ernie Pena was essentially like the Filipino American community historian. He would always show up with his camera and to just capture all the moments. Papo de Assis is this amazing artist who has created works that are it makes me speechless whenever I would see something. So it's just fascinating because you're really talking about your relationships, and I think most of our community work has always been built about relationships, and I feel like folks who don't do community organizing, when you say I'm a community organizer, people are like, what the hell does that mean? And it's really relationship building, right?
And community building.
And community building.
I think the thing that drew me to even just wanting to talk about Little Tokyo in general was this idea that we talk about kind of our experiences, and a lot of it centered in the fact that we are in Los Angeles, that we're either from Los Angeles, have strong connections to that. And a lot of our listeners tend to be from places that don't have that same quite kind of, numbers of just Filipinos, let alone Asian Americans.
Yes.
But what I've always found fascinating about Little Tokyo is that, somehow or another, because of this historical connections, because of, the people who really kind of paved the way for us, like you've laid out around Linda and other folks, that we've basically built community in the spaces that we could inhabit. Whether that was going to be historic Filipino town in some ways, whether or not it's going to be, even, in places like the South Bay, Carson, Torrance, Glendale. I mean, all the different kind of centers of Filipino American activity, we found a way to kind of build a very unique kind of space and voice and build from there. And Little Tokyo always stands out to me because I have a lot of the same connections that you guys all talked about. And the other thing is just recognizing the fact that a lot of these organizations that are here in Little Tokyo, you work at the JCCC, and there's other folks that also work in different organizations throughout this community, like Francis, who we're going to talk to in a little bit. And who else? I mean, you probably
so there's a joke right now in Little Tokyo. We call ourselves Filter, FILTR. Filipinos in Little Tokyo represent. And we don't have T-shirts or anything, and we
got to do something about
that.
It's
at the joke level right now. I think we hang out at Far Bar on occasion.
We like a good pun, don't we?
Yeah.
And acronyms, yes.
But East West Players, they're in the Union Center for the Arts, which is a couple blocks from here, which is also the same building that Visual Communications is in. East West Players has had several Filipino Americans work in the office as admin staff, have amazing artists on stage. You have, Visual Communications, where you have Francis and Abe Ferrer and Linda Mobalo used to be their executive director. David Magdale, who has his own company now, but so many people I think have filtered in and out of those organizations.
Isil Borlasa is from there, works there now as the operations director for the festival, the Los Angeles Asian Pacific Film Festival.
And then you have the Japanese American National Museum, and it's and also its National Center for Preservation of Democracy. You have the Japanese American Cultural Community Center. At the community development level, you have Little Tokyo Service Center, which actually has helped to support Filipino Worker Center to get in Filipino town to get their space. You have, then, they're about to open this basketball gym that the community has been trying to build in Little Tokyo for 40 years, 50 years almost. And then as we were kind of talking about this episode, I was like, yeah, and I found out about a year ago that Rimban Briones, who is at Nishi, he is Filipino Mexican, and he's a Buddhist Rimban who's part of the larger community here, and we're hoping at some point to get a chance to talk to him, because I think he's also a Central Valley guy too.
Oh wow, we should definitely.
So I think in and around Little Tokyo, Philippine, and I was thinking about Faye Santia's line from Ruby Ibarra's song Us, like Pinays have always been part and parcel to the movement. We've always been in this work, and I think what is interesting about what I learn all the time working here at JACCC is I meet people who, because I'm multiracial, because I look, and because a lot of the Japanese American community is mixed race, a lot of people will just be like, oh, you've got to be Japanese. And they kind of just
There's a presumption.
They just presume, and then they kind of move on. And then I've had experiences in this last year where men of a certain age from Japan will stop me and they'll be like, wait. Like, none of you is Japanese? And they do a origin check with me. And not because they don't think I should be here, but the question is always like, well, why do you care? Like, why here? And even when I started here at JACCC on staff, I started in the fall of 2015 officially. I had already worked at East West Players. I'd worked at the Pasadena Playhouse. I'd worked for About Productions, a small Latinx-oriented theater company in Pasadena. And I'd done work in diverse communities in LA, but when I got here, Filipinos were the first to be like, why are you working there? Like, why aren't you doing stuff for us? And, my initial response is, well, I've always done stuff for us. I was 25 years old when I ran the Festival of Filipino Arts and Culture, and I moved us from Cabrillo Beach to Point Fermin. I was the first FBAC director when we brought Joe Batan from New York, and so I know so much of my training comes from being an artist and being in the Filipino community and doing that work. So much of what I'm oriented towards in terms of my social justice perspectives is informed by, I think, our intersectional organizing in the Philam community. And then a lot of it is deep humility when I understand and hear about the trauma and the tragedies of the Japanese American community, the African American community, the history of communities in Boyle Heights, and just the way that LA people like to say that we're the city that forgets. Yeah. And I feel like because of Linda and other elders, I realized in my 20s, my job is to be someone who remembers. My job is to be someone who helps people to not just remember, but to you can't remember something if you don't know it. Yeah. And so, so the facts that I'm able to rattle off right now are part of my own process of I'm not a trained historian, but I certainly came up in Fonz in my college years, and how I met a whole lot of folks, and I'm inspired by, Fred and Dorothy Cordova and all that community of folks. Because I know, as a mixed kid who didn't have a family here, I know what it's like to grow up without history. And I know what it's like to have this feeling. I feel this way about Tagalog. I can't speak it, but something inside of me understands it. Yes. And so I feel in Little Tokyo, it makes sense to me that Filipinos were here. Yeah. Because we've always been here, and we've always been read as something else, right? Yeah. We're always a convenient, and I actually took a staff member. We went to the Chinese American Museum for the culmination of a project, and I took him to the plaque where all of the founders of Olvera Street were. And I said, there's a story that there's a Filipino family that actually was in the wagon train that came up, and they're not in the plaque because one of the daughters got sick Do you know that story?
I've heard that.
I've
yeah.
heard that story.
So
yeah.
I'm sure Joe can clarify.
Yeah.
And even if it's just only oral history, like it makes complete sense to me. Like Filipinos we're everywhere.
Yes.
And I was actually at a party last weekend and some elders were like asking me like what I am, and they were like, oh, I see Filipinos though that look like this or that look like that. I was like, Filipinos look like everything.
Yeah.
I was like, that's why when I see mixed Filipinos or even full-blooded Filipinos, I'm like, the minute someone says to me they're Filipino, I'm like, okay, I got you.
Yeah, totally. There's not just one way to look and be Filipino.
But I mean, just like as a metaphor for how we've kind of become a part of this city, you know, maybe, you know, mythical kind of like connection to the origins of it, but just the way that we've kind of found spaces within this place. You know, the fact that like we've been able to kind of build very unique communities even within Los Angeles, I think is kind of like what I find so fascinating, and maybe unique to places that are like as concentrated of Asian Americans in general, you know. But like just that idea that Filipino-ness, you know, is not a monolithic idea.
No.
It's what we carry with us, right? That legacy of the people that kind of brought us up, that connection, maybe, you know, maybe even the most tangential to kind of like the motherland, but just this idea that, you know, our value around building community, building culture, but also kind of like growing it. You know, you're here as you know, the product and result of people like Linda, and now you're in a place in which you get a chance to like not only like maybe carry that legacy, but kind of build a completely new one entirely. And I think that's just kind of one of the ways that, you know, when we talk about this Filipino American life, you know, it's not like this thing that we can just describe with like, you know, dance competitions and like adobo, you know, but it's really kind of just this idea that, you know, we're survivors. We're survivors, and we thrive on the idea that we're always willing to kind of grow, fill, and change, but always still represent Filipino-ness in some fashion or another, and also be able to just spot it right away and just own it, you know.
Yeah.
So.
There is like an article that I think Advancing Justice, which is like a legal or social justice organization, and that's national. But the article was about the Japanese American woman, and like the title said like, remembering is resistance. And so like, and that's in reference to acknowledging and remembering Japanese internment in World War II. And so like, but like that whole phrase, remembering is resistance, and now you're talking about like you're somebody who chooses to like be the person to remember, like it's very much in a city that folks think has no history or no knowledge, like Los Angeles, no culture sometimes. Like that there are people in place who are actively trying to remember. And I think that's like with this, our show, like, you know, we are chronicling and actively trying to remember and learn all our stories. And even if you're not from LA, like we still want to know who you are and what that story is, because like, this is just one piece of the story, like Little Tokyo and talking to folks, like it's our way of resistance, of always of putting it out there that like we were here, we are always here, and we'll be here, right?
And in a few weeks from the recording of this episode, we're going to be heading to Seattle, where I'm always fascinated when we do those kind of things, because it's like understanding how the cultural negotiation kind of happens there too in the cultural building. But just we're coming up on our time. Is there any last thoughts or feelings?
Ooh, can we do like rapid fire questions about?
Yes.
Okay. All right. So this is like off the top of the head. Favorite sweet spot in Little Tokyo?
Fugetsudo or Cafe Dulce?
Oh, me too?
Oh no, I'm just saying like think of a question. Oh no, like favorite lunch spot in Little Tokyo?
Oh, right now I'm so hardcore on the Ebisu rotation. Because they have these cool ropes and you can hide in the little booths.
Oh, I do that. Yeah.
Favorite spot to show off to people who are here for the first time?
Oh, good question.
Well, aside from JACCC where I work. I think it depends on who the guest is and what they're into. Like some people are into a certain kind of karaoke, so it's like a choice between like Max's Karaoke and the Galleria, or like the karaoke spot in the Miyako Hotel, which if you've never been to that spot is pretty fun. I don't know the name of it. And actually one of my favorite Filipino American musical theater memories is with Brian Rivera. From that, we hung out at an Asian American theater conference at that karaoke bar, and then after ended up, when they closed the bar, a bunch of us were leaving, and Brian and I ended up standing on First Street singing Rent. And then, Brian has toured with the National Company of King and I. He was on Broadway in King and I with Ken Watanabe and all those folks. He's from Sacramento. He's an amazing artist. He's also been in a Klingon version of Hamlet online, which you should look him up.
That's amazing.
I think honestly, the other place I would take people is to First Street. I would take them to East West Players. I work at JACCC now, but East West Players really, I credit East West Players and Ken Narasaki from helping me to understand that the world I knew as a spoken word poet at a mic changed when Ken said, poets and playwrights care about the same thing. You care about where words are, and you could be a playwright. And I knew I wanted to write my one-woman show, but I never knew I could name myself as a playwright. And so that window, that key, helped me to understand and unlock how much I care about stories and how that's really, Hawaiians call it kuleana. That's my responsibility, is to give that gift to other people. The last thing I want to say is, here at the Japanese American Cultural and Community Center, we have the Aratani Theater, which is probably the largest Asian American theater in the country. And we've had on our stage everybody from Lea Salonga to now Manila Luzon to Martin Rivera to a range of folks, Amar Cobbling, who was in Allegiance with us, and not just Filipinos, but so many important elders in the diverse Asian American, Pacific Islander, South Asian, Southeast Asian, Native Hawaiian communities. And I, because I'm from here, LA, because I'm from here, Carson, because I'm from here, Little Tokyo, I just find we need to not be afraid of being all of our multiple selves. Mm-hmm. And we need to not limit who we know ourselves to be, because other people in our lives I feel like we come from magical, as somebody who used to live in Tacoma, Washington, when you live in a place where there are not a lot of Filipinos or not a lot of people of color, you sometimes feel like a magical unicorn. Mm. And just because you're your own unicorn doesn't mean there's not a unicorn homeland or a unicorn neighborhood. And that's why I love this show, because you bring that to people whenever they listen. And the people I know who listen to you all around the country where there's no other Filipinos feel that connection. So, thanks.
Aww.
Maraming salamat, yo.
Thanks, Allison.
Thank you.
You see this dead air right now, right in between the breaks, between the shows? Just me breathing. Well, we can actually fill this dead air with an ad. What? Yes. If you're a business out there, or you want to promote an event, or want to sponsor us, you can buy an ad right here in this space.
During this time?
Yes, that time.
Wow. Cool. What do they need to do?
All they need to do is email us at thisfilipinoamericanlife@gmail.com and just email us what you want to do.
Cool. So buy an ad
Today.
Buy an ad.
Buy an ad. Buy an ad. Yeah.
Yeah.
We are in the basement of the Union Center for the Arts, the home of visual communications, which, if you're an avid listener of the podcast, we've done a couple episodes here. We did Cinema Sala with Marie Jamora a couple of months ago now, right? Mm-hmm. Where we did an interview in front of a live audience there, too. But today, we're with one of our oldest friends and colleagues, Kennedy Cabasares.
Hello, I'm Kennedy Cabasares.
And you are both a resident and somebody who's worked in very many different places and spaces throughout Little Tokyo, right?
Yeah, I'm a I call it a denizen of Little Tokyo. Mm-hmm. So I'm a Little Tokyo resident, and I used to work at here at Visual Communications, and I've worked several times with East West Players and JACCC, and I'm a frequent visitor of Janum and Sua Heroes.
A favorite spot for many of us here.
Yeah. What's your favorite dish at Suhiro's?
Tanindon or Tanindon. What's beef? It's beef, rice, and egg, or it's the pork, rice, and egg. I don't know what the pork, rice, and egg is. Maybe it's Tanindon. Tanindon.
I'm getting hungry.
You know, we're like, we gotta eat dinner right after this, right? But so yeah, how long have you been living here now? It feels like forever, obviously.
Yeah,
but, you know,
I think it was 2001. I moved in here to Little Tokyo, so I've been here for like 18 years.
Oh my gosh.
At least, yeah.
You can have a debut.
I'll have to buy a dress for that.
We could go to Santi and get one.
Yeah, that's true. It's nearby. You could walk down to Santee Alley.
and so 2001. I mean, what drew you here in the first place, and you know, what was it like back then?
Well, I was burnt out of my old apartment. So, my old apartment, I used to live in Koreatown, and there was a fire at my.
Oh, literally burnt out. I thought you were just like tired of it.
No, there was a fire. There was an actual fire at my apartment, and I had no place to live. So I lived at in my friend's house for like 2 or 3 months, and then I found an apartment here in Little Tokyo, and it was right next to everything I ever do anyway. So it made sense. So, and I've been stuck here because it's not stuck in a bad way, but
Rent control?
Rent control.
There you go.
Rent control is number one. Number two, I used to work at Visual Communications and East West Players, and like every place I eat is here, and all my friends come down here anyway. So it's next to all the freeways, so you know it's the most convenient place and the easiest place to find my friends because of the arts district, and they have the music center up the hill with the Center Theater Group and all that, and yeah, and everyone just hangs out down here because it's a cool place. So
Yeah.
But yeah, going back to 2001, and you've already kind of identified some of the things that you've been involved with. What were you doing at that time specifically?
I was working at Visual Communications actually. So my first real exposure to Little Tokyo, other than just visiting it for food or was, I believe, my first heavy involvement in Little Tokyo was with Visual Communications. I believe it was 1998 or 1999. I volunteered for the film festival, the Los Angeles Asian American Film Festival. And I volunteered a lot during the year. Even when the festival was over, I still volunteered at Visual Communications. And
How did you hear about it that you would volunteer?
I knew somebody who volunteered. Actually, I worked at FPAC, the Festival of Philippine Arts and Culture in Los Angeles.
Which we also have many connections to.
Yeah.
I worked at FPAC, and the person who was supervising me, his name was Jerome Academia.
Oh, yeah.
He's a musician, and he's also a community dude. And in addition to working for FPAC, he worked for Visual Communications, and he said, you know, we're always looking for volunteers, so I volunteered for them. And then I volunteered a lot with Visual Communications just because I loved, you know, the people who was working there, and just the fact that they supported Asian American filmmakers. So there were all these filmmakers that I knew and I've heard of, and all these actors that I knew, and we were somewhat involved in their lives. So I enjoyed volunteering for them. And then at one point, Linda said, "You're pretty good. You should work here." So I was like, okay. And I thought it was just a temporary thing, and it turned out I ended up working here for like 12 years.
Wow.
Oh, man.
Yeah.
And even that feels like shorter than I think I would have thought, actually. But no, Leia, Linda Mabala, right?
Yeah.
So you were here during the time of her leadership of this organization. So it was like you, Jerome was here, you were here, and Abe Ferrer. But yeah, I mean, in other words, there was a good preponderance of Filipinos involved with this organization back then, and even I would say today, right?
Yeah.
And, you know, and I mean, Visual Communications, I mean, could you talk a little bit more about what Visual Communications is and kind of like its role in the community?
Yeah, Visual Communications is an Asian American media arts group. So in general, in the big general thing is that they support Filipino American media artists, filmmakers, and one of the biggest ways that they support it is Asian American filmmakers is through the Los Angeles Asian American Film Festival, Los Angeles Asian Pacific American Film Festival. So that's their big thing that they do, and they're based here in Little Tokyo, but they support all Asian American artists, Asian American media artists.
So Linda seems to be like a person that a lot of people speak of when we think about Little Tokyo. We spoke to Allison, and she mentioned Linda really mentoring her and getting her involved in the community. And it sounds like she did that to you.
Somewhat, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, go ahead. Did you have a question?
And I'm just thinking, like, I remember when I got involved with the community, like Linda had already passed, so I didn't get to interact with her. But it feels like I've always known, like, felt her presence, because it feels like she, like, injected her spirit into all these other people.
Yeah, she came to Los Angeles from, I believe, Sacramento in the 80s. And she got involved with the movement, the Asian American movement, which was, I think, Little Tokyo was one of the, hubs of the Asian American movement in the 80s, the late 70s and 80s. And she was involved with media arts. So she comes from that school, that old school grassroots organizing, and she just focused on media arts and in the nonprofit world. But she came from that school of grassroots, organizing and the Asian American movement in general.
So in visual communications, has it always been in Little Tokyo? Like, did it start out here? I mean,
as far as I know, yes. I mean, there was. Let me think. Before it was it was here at the Union Center of the Arts, and then it was on Los Angeles Street, which is just outside Little Tokyo. And even before that, they were at the JACCC.
Oh, okay.
And I think before that, they were at people's houses. They pretty much were based in Little Tokyo.
Yeah, and I mean, when we were talking to Allison and just thinking about all the organizations that are here in Little Tokyo, this is a space of like an incubator for, a lot of organizations that still kind of are standing today and doing a lot of things culturally. But also interesting that like somehow or another Filipino Americans have been involved in all of that in some form or another. And so you've seen kind of like the history of like this neighborhood, and that, a lot of your friends are here and like a lot of the things that you've done of here. Is there any specific reason you think why, or is it just because of the kind of the nuances of what Los Angeles Asian American community is like, I guess?
I think it's partially the nuance of the Asian community in Los Angeles. I think it's just that there is, because East-West Players and Visual Communications are such pan-Asian organizations, but I think it's the location of it. It's like central. Little Tokyo is it's really in downtown LA, and it's central to right in the middle of, East LA, the West Side, and the Valley, and the South Bay. It's like right in the center. Like you've got all those freeways passing through downtown LA, so it's easy access to everything. And I think it's just the nature of Little Tokyo also, just the way it, like I said, it has a lot of history of it, Asian American history. Especially with Japanese Americans, there's been a lot of history here. So they have a foothold here. They have this Asian American presence here that was severely affected for many, like during World War II. It was severely affected because of the Japanese incarceration, and then in the 80s because of the Asian American movements. It was very strong in this neighborhood as well. And also our proximity to City Hall and the Federal Building. I think a lot of those protests during the 70s would end up here. Yeah.
There's a lot of those pictures of like all the different protests in the 70s and the 80s. Some of like kind of like the culmination and building of like kind of like the modern Asian American kind of movement.
Yeah.
And like that being a very like pan-ethnic kind of experience. Because I think about like, so I come from Oxnard, which is I'm not going to say like is
a farm town.
Okay, it's a farm town, but I think kind of like the idea of like kind of this kind of pan-ethnic melding. It kind of was there amongst kind of like the kids, but like my parents would be like, "Oh, you're hanging out with like those Chinese kids again or something." Like it was like weird that I was kind of extending myself outside of like kind of our usual kind of like family and like folks.
Where did you grow up, Kennedy?
San Francisco.
And so, did you grow up in like a Filipino American community, or is it also Pan-Asian like how Little Tokyo is?
It was kind of Pan-Asian. It was mixed. It was a lot of everything. It was as far as Asians were concerned, it was mixed. There was a lot of Filipinos. There were a lot of Filipinos, and still are. Chinese, Japanese, Koreans, Vietnamese, a little bit Latinos, a lot of white people, some African Americans. But it was very as far as the Asian American community, there is a strong Filipino. Well, when I was growing up, there was definitely a strong Filipino American community up there, Filipino American presence in San Francisco. In addition to a Pan-Asian, community, but there was a strong Filipino presence up there.
And then what brought you to LA?
Acting.
Acting?
Yeah, being a performer, acting.
You came to LA, the city of dreams, to pursue your art?
Yeah, well, I came here for an audition once, and then like I said, there's an Asian American acting community in San Francisco, but San Francisco is pretty small.
Yeah.
So you run into the same people, and you
compete for the same parts.
Not necessarily. It's just that there's I think just the numbers of projects up there just a lot less than there would be. And I came down to Los Angeles and I went for an audition, and there were all these Asian American actors.
Yeah.
These dudes who looked like me.
Yeah.
And they're all actors. I'm like, man, this is where everyone's going. I should go here. All the Asian Americans are going here to LA. I should go here too. And then because there was so much more. Comparatively, so much more work down here to do.
Got it.
Yeah. So. So I decided to move down here.
Got it.
So do you consider yourself primarily an actor, kind of
performer,
even throughout the things that you've done for VC and Film Arts? And things like that? It's always been kind of your calling.
Yeah, well, the arts has been my calling. Right now I identify as a performer, a performing artist is what a performing artist, because that encapsulates acting and circus and anything else, any kind of performance. I've done performance art type stuff, which was really cool. So I call myself a performing artist.
Because I believe we were introduced to you through Tuesday Night Cafe or through Zero Three.
Well,
yes.
A little bit of both. I think like around the time that we met you and Edrin Sumagaisa and Tracy Kito Kiriyama was in the early 2000s, kind of like when a lot of this stuff was kind of really developing. And I think it was probably like Tracy or Edrin who was like, hey, we had this thing in Little Tokyo called Tuesday Night Cafe. You should come out. This is like 2001, 2002.
Yeah.
Right when it was just a couple years in already. And then coming to that space and kind of like, and this is before I really kind of understood the Asian American community of Los Angeles really kind of writ large, and recognizing that like, oh, here's a space where we're all coming together, a lot of representation from different communities, but kind of, coming together to kind of create art in very many different ways.
Yeah.
I mean, primarily poetry at the time, but I think now if you come to a Tuesday Night Cafe, still here in Little Tokyo, it's kind of like runs the gamut of all the kind of different creative forms. But yeah, I mean, you were part of, well, actually, 03, which without just like mentioning it, without contextualizing it, what was 03? Or what is 03?
03 was a three-person, again, performing arts / poetry / theatrical. Oh God, we had it was kind of like a hybrid. It was poetry / monologue / scene work that we would bring around to colleges and tour and perform here. At
if I dig through my archives, I still have one of your press kits. So maybe.
Oh Lord, yeah. Find that description because I forgot what it was. I completely forgot. That was years ago, but we weren't. That was hard because we would go to poetry readings, but we weren't necessarily all poetry. We would do, like I said, we would do poetry. Part of our performance was poetry, but it was also monologues, like theatrical monologues and scene work. We would do scenes together, and sometimes we'd sing. So it was hybrid. Well, it was interesting because. Poets would call us a poetry group, and then musicians would say you're kind of like a band, but with words, And then theater people would say, oh, you're kind of like a theater group,
like a performance troupe kind of thing.
Yeah. So like we would it would encapsulate a couple of brands, I suppose, or arts, umbrellas that we would be under.
Did that come from? Were you all in Here and Now? Was that how that started? Or
I wasn't officially in Here and Now, but I've worked with Here and Now in some of their productions.
God.
And what is Here and Now?
Here and Now was an Asian American theater group.
I think they're still around.
I think
The Asian American theater group. I believe they're still around. They're still doing some shows.
Yeah. And so it's just fascinating how like in that era, it's like all these theater people doing. It's like you wanted to have another outlet for your work. I suppose.
Yeah. Yeah, they always say go out and create your own work, and so Tracy and Edrin and I created our own work, and it wasn't necessarily, but we were a hybrid of people. We were writers and performers and actors, so it was not just poetry. It was performance. It was definitely performance based.
Yeah,
but it involved poetry and theatrical stuff. And Little Tokyo was our home. I mean, we would meet here at VC. Sometimes we'd rehearse here at VC. We'd do shows at JACCC, and I think we did shows at Janum, I think. And we did a JACCC produced show here at East West Players. So we were very Little Tokyo centric.
Yeah. Those are all like within like blocks of each other.
Yeah.
And even the Tuesday Night Cafe that we've been mentioning a lot is like basically upstairs from here in the courtyard in front of the Union Center for the Arts. So, I mean, I think like when Elaine and I were in college and we started kind of like meeting all of you and kind of encountering kind of like what was then kind of like a really kind of active, I mean, still is a very active kind of Asian American kind of like art scene. A lot of it was, and I think that's maybe why you guys got kind of maybe sometimes pigeonholed as like a poetry group, because there was a lot of poetry crews. There was even a show at the JCCC that I went to, 2003, 2004, 2003. It was you, Balagtasan Collective.
Yes.
And I Was Born with Two Tongues.
Yes, that's right. Oh my God, I forgot about that show. That was a fun show.
But which Elaine will remember because I skipped out on her PCN to go see the show instead.
It was my last PCN ever.
Filipino Cultural Night at UC Irvine. Sorry.
But Mike dropped off a cake and then was like, peace out. I got to go to Little Tokyo to watch.
I was like, it's like I Was Born with Two Tongues and 03 and Balagtasan Collective. All this
I barely remember that show, but I just remember it was fun.
Well, like as an actor, you always have like I've always heard that you have to like just have like a really like quick turnover in terms of memory, right? Because of like scripts and whatnot. You
have to memorize the script really quickly, and then you do it over and over.
Forget.
And then you got to forget, and then do a brand new script. So it's hard.
But now, as a performer, you mentioned circus. How did you get into circus, and what does that mean, circus?
Okay, well, I'm also a circus artist. Well, if you want to go way back, and I mentioned it in the show that we just did, I went to a performing arts high school in San Francisco. That's where I got into acting and all that kind of stuff.
Way back, like 5 years ago.
Way back way back when we didn't even have cell phones. Gosh, we had the rotary phones, and we didn't have the internet. And, so I went to a performing arts high school, and I believe twice a week we had a circus artist come. There was a woman named Judy Finelli, and she was with this circus called the Pickle Family Circus. They're no longer around, but in the late 70s and early 80s, they were like San Francisco's version of the early days of Cirque du Soleil, where they were taking circus and turning it into theater.
Wow.
So she would come and teach at our school. So alongside my acting class, I would have circus class. So I would learn how to juggle and tumble and do stuff like that.
That was a class in high school?
Yeah, I went to performing arts high school.
That's so cool.
Yeah. So that was part of the whole performance training that we had. We had dance, we had acting, we had improv, and then we had circus. We also had vocal coaching and that kind of thing in this school, so it was pretty well rounded. So then when I went to college, I just studied theater, but I never really pursued circus again until I believe 2003. Yeah, it was 2003. I think there was a school here, a circus studio here in Los Angeles, and I was like, well, I always kind of like circus. I'll give it a try. And I tried flying trapeze, and it was fun, but it wasn't very expressive. From what I thought, it wasn't very expressive. Although there are awesome flying trapeze artists who can do really amazing stuff, but I didn't. It was fun, but I didn't find it like theatrical for me. And then they had a static trapeze class, which is a solo trapeze, and it doesn't swing. I took that class, and I was like, "Oh my God, this is it!" And so since then, I literally never stopped doing circus since 2003.
Wow.
Yeah.
So it's something you've always had then, because I think I was like when you started kind of really getting into it again.
Yeah.
I mean, I guess I didn't realize you had that history and connection
I
to
didn't
it, and I was like, oh, Kenny's doing this now. That's interesting. Yeah.
Yeah, it was, yeah. Static trapeze is my main apparatus, but I do other aerial arts. I dabble in cordelice, which is a rope, in the silks or the tissue. That's about it right now. But I mean, anything air related, I've dabbled in, like straps, and I've dabbled in this thing called cloud swing, and I've experimented with bungee trapeze, which is
What is
crazy.
cloud swing?
It's a rope that's hung loosely between 2 points, so it's kind of like if you hung a jump rope from a ceiling. So you hang from it, so it's like on both sides of you, and you just do tricks on it.
Yeah.
It's pretty cool.
So what was the show that just closed?
Tracy Kato Kiriyama and I are an ensemble theater group called Pull Project, and we did a show at the Japanese American Cultural Community Center's Aratani Black Box Theater called Tales of Clamor, which is Pull Project is a hybrid theater circus ensemble group, which is primarily me and Tracy, but this time we had a cast of 5 other actors besides me and Tracy, and it was a play that it's about the clamor that you need to the noise that you have to make in order to create change in society. And it's a story of these 2 artists today, Tracy's character and my character. And my character is a circus performer, and her character is a writer. And we talk about the clamor that, the noise that we need to create change in the world today. And we look back at the 80s, during the time where Japanese Americans were speaking up for Japanese American redress for the internment camps of the 1940s during World War II. So it bounces back in time between the 80s and now, and we're looking at that moment of time in the 80s where all these Japanese Americans came together and got their elders to speak out for redress, and we take that as a model for what we should do today, or as an example or an inspiration for what we can do today.
Yeah, Mike and I saw that. We saw it, and one of the lines that I appreciated or scenes is when the 2 characters are talking to each other, and you're like, "Why should I care? I'm Filipino."
Yeah, we had to address that because I'm a Filipino American, and so the one of the questions as a writer is, why would he be in it? Why would he join in on that? And so she lays it out on to him, saying, well, this involves everybody. To create change, you can't do it alone. It's you could do it alone, but it's so much easier if you bring everyone in it. Everyone who's affected by it can come together. It can be something powerful.
Yeah. And most of the time in the show, you were like in circus contraptions. Is that what you call it?
Apparatuses.
Apparatus?
Yeah.
Was one of them the cloud thing that you were saying, or no?
No.
It was like
there was. I did several things. I did the silk. I did a frame, aerial silk, aerial frame. I did. I juggled scarves.
So is the silk?
Stilts.
Was the silk the long pieces of silk?
The long white fabric.
Yeah.
The white long tissue. It's called tissue in Europe. I call it tissue. It's also called the silk or fabric here in the U.S.
Because as somebody who has ClassPass, which is like an app where you do fitness classes, that apparatus. I've seen it it's like aerial yoga or something. Or something like that.
You can do aerial yoga in those using that, or they use something called a hammock, which is more like a loop. It's like a hammock, but it's made of that material, and you can do some stuff in there.
But you were doing like things that I've seen Pink do on like like Grammy Awards shows or something because she does like all those aerial performances. So I have a question.
Sure.
Are you afraid of heights?
Yes, I am.
Okay. Another question. Then how do you get up in the air and fly and attach yourself to a silk?
It's really different because those apparatuses that I'm using, I know those apparatuses and I know how they're rigged and I know the limits of what they can do. Those are my apparatuses, so I know how to maintain them. So I know exactly what they can do and what I can do on them. But if I'm on a ladder, I don't know whose ladder that is. I don't know, or if I'm on a balcony, I don't know how old that railing is, I don't know if this, is it rusty? I don't know. So I if I'm on a cliff, I don't know if it's going to erode.
So there's like a natural connection to you that you understand it well enough that it doesn't feel like you're just hanging in the air, dangerously in any way. It's like exactly you're controlling it in a way.
Yeah, I know my limits and I know the limits of the apparatus, so I know the parameters with which I can operate in. But if I'm on even if I'm I've been in tall buildings in downtown, like I go up 23 floors or whatever, and I can't go near the windows. I'm just like I just don't want to look out that window.
Oh my gosh.
Or it's freaky. Even on a tall, even on a long elevator ride, if I'm in if I'm in an elevator and it's a long time, I think in my head, I'm going really high in the air. I don't know how long I can stay in this elevator. I'm gonna freak out. So,
like on a roller coaster, would you be like,
I'm okay on a roller coaster because you're strapped in and there's really,
So I mean, was it always the intention to have circus integrated into Tales from the very beginning? And do you feel like there was a specific kind of theme or kind of emotion you were trying to kind of get by the different apparatuses or modes that you used for that?
Well, Pull Project is a hybrid of circus and theater just from its onset because originally. Pull Project started as two people, me and Tracy. And Tracy, is an actor, performer, writer, and I'm an actor, performer, circus artist. So it just made sense to put those two, somehow use circus artists. Because we always said, if I was an opera singer, we'd put opera in there. But I'm not an opera singer. I'm a circus artist. So that's what it is. So it was always the intention to have circus in Tales of Clamor. But we also have this thing, like we can't just put circus there without it having some kind of meaning for the story.
it needs to make sense.
Yeah.
You're not just throwing it in there.
It has to have some kind of symbolism, or it has to move the story along. We can't have a play and all of a sudden pause and then look at all this circus stuff and then move on. The circus stuff has to be part of the story. It has to further the story. It has to have some kind of meaning within the story.
It sounds like a reinvention of what circus, like a circus show could be. And I'm sure like that's the whole point of Cirque du Soleil type, those shows in Vegas.
Yeah.
But I don't know if I've ever seen that.
Yeah, I think the most effective moment, or at least the one that struck me the most was like, in the end when everybody was crossing on that beam.
Oh, the tightrope. Yes.
Tightrope,
yes.
yeah. And it was just like, I don't know if you guys are going to produce the show again and show it again, but I mean, I don't want to spoil it for anybody, but I mean, like, it's kind of in this moment in which kind of like, it's kind of like at the height of
it's like a precipice of emotion. Yeah.
Yeah. When it's like they're about to kind of just testify and tell their story about their experiences in the camps and, why, people need to remember that this is a thing that happened and that they're coming together to kind of make sure the world doesn't forget. But also it's a thing that a lot of them had contended with for so long and weren't really quite sure if they even wanted to tell that story. But I just thought like in that moment, it was just like, wow, that using that in that moment just felt like, it definitely kind of emphasized and like really, elevated kind of that moment, I think, for me.
Sure. Well, we hope so. I mean, as a circus artist, during that show, everything I threw in there that was circus related, I always put in there just thinking, I hope people understand why it's here. I hope people understand why I'm juggling or why I'm walking on this giant globe. There's a globe. Or I hope people understand why I'm on this silk, why I'm doing that, and what I'm doing on the trapeze. And it just has to make sense.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, the tightrope part. was like when all the crying happened. As an audience member for me, that's when all the crying and tears happened. It's very good.
So yeah, I mean, for anyone listening, if you ever hear about something called Tales of Clamor, happening again, and you're in the area, you should definitely, try to make some time. I mean, I'm hoping you guys find a way to do it again.
We're hoping to. We're already brainstorming about how we can present it again.
That's awesome.
But I think the other thing that you mentioned earlier about how, you identifying yourself very plainly and clearly that you're Filipino and like, why should I care? And I was just thinking about how that relates back to kind of like, that Asian American movement we were talking about that was happening here in LA in the 70s and 80s, and how it wasn't just about, my Filipino American experience or like kind of like what's happening with the Japanese Americans and then trying to get redress. It was about the idea that we could come together behind a lot of these different kind of issues, causes, and opportunities to really build together. That really kind of is what is distinct, I think, about LA's Asian American community. I mean, it exists in other places too, but I think as I kind of learned about it, and I learned about it through people like you and Tracy and other folks about, it's not just about kind of like me and my Filipino American life. It's really kind of about like, how that intersects with kind of other people in other communities. And, we live in historic Filipino town, but like Little Tokyo has always really kind of been kind of our home, really, in many different ways.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, I mean, it is as an Asian American. There's a lot of there's a lot of crossover with our issues. I mean, there are definitely issues that are specific to each Asian American community because of our history here. But there are also a lot of issues that intersect because of our Asian-ness, and so I think we just have to keep our eyes on that, or just be aware of that there is a lot of overlap, intersectionality in our in the Pan-Asian issues here in the United States.
Yeah, and it really sounds like Linda. She fostered that community and pan-ethnic, pan-Asian intersectionality.
Yeah, she was very she was very aware of the different histories of the Asian Americans and how it all fit in and how it. She was Filipino American, and she was into Filipino American history, but along with that, and I think that it probably came, I'm only guessing here. It probably came from that era of the movement, the general Asian American movement of being aware of the other the histories of all the other Asian Americans in the United States. Because like I said, there are each ethnicity has a different history here in the United States, but we also have a lot of commonalities.
Yeah.
And I think the thing that we're finding as we kind of talk to everybody is just like, Little Tokyo is one of those places, at least, where a lot of that kind of comes together, collides, but also kind of becomes something new and different.
Yeah, if for some reason in Los Angeles, it not necessarily naturally, but the Pan-Asian-ness easily works here in Little Tokyo. Also because our proximity to Chinatown, it's close to Chinatown, and it's close to it's not very far from historic Filipino town. It's not very far from East LA, which has a Latino population. So there's a lot of this like awareness of immigrant populations and immigrant issues because of all these different immigrant communities which are so close to Little Tokyo.
And Little Tokyo in particular has been kind of that crossroads for a lot of different communities throughout the history of it.
Even African American communities also.
Yeah. And so now you are a resident of, well, you've been a resident of Little Tokyo for...
He said 18 years.
18 years. I almost want to ask, like, what building are you?
Let's have all your. You want my apartment number? You want to knock on my door? You got it.
But I mean, as we're probably going to get into in a different part of this episode, Filipinos have lived here for even like generations ago, and like this was kind of a crossroads for like some.
It's like you're continuing. Legacy.
You're like the new era Carlos Bolosan or whatever.
Oh my God, Kennedy, new era Carlos Bolosan.
Did he live in Little Tokyo?
That's kind of the mythology around some of this. And so, and I think we'll get into that a little later.
Wow, I didn't know that.
Because the flower shop on California, is it called California?
It's like near Weller Court.
Near Weller Court, there's a flower shop that used to be
on
a
the
hotel.
corner.
Manongs used to live in that building.
Did not know that.
Yeah.
See, that's a there you go. That's a then I feel like I don't feel like such a such an outsider.
I mean, on top of like the Filipinos who lived in Bunker Hill and everything
Yeah.
else, so,
Yeah, so it's just that
So
like
that's up the street.
yeah, and I feel like it's really easy to just fall into the trap of like an ethnic enclave, like that only the people in the ethnic enclave will have a presence or a history there.
Yeah.
So if it's Little Tokyo, you're just gonna think, oh, Japanese people live there or Japanese
Yeah.
Americans.
Yeah.
But it's more nuanced than that. Like Boyle Heights, which is like literally across the bridge.
Mm-hmm.
There are Latinos, but there has a historic
Japanese American.
Japanese American
Yes,
community,
Japanese.
and then there were Jewish
community,
Americans
yes.
that live there, and it's kind of like the jump is Boyle Heights is just Latino.
Yeah, that's
You
the over the
perception.
the bigger perception is that Boyle Heights is a Latino community, but if you look at the history, there was definitely a Japanese American community there as well. Yeah, there was a big Jewish presence, and there's still a
That's where
temple there, I think.
Cantor's Deli used to originally be there on Brooklyn Avenue.
Did not know that either. Hey, but I know there's a temple in Boyle Heights.
Oh
isn't there?
yeah.
Yeah.
There's still
Yeah, in the middle of a Latino neighborhood. That's really it. So see, I learned something today. I didn't know that there was I didn't know that Carlos Bulasan had a.
Well, that's like oral history, maybe
Okay.
mythology.
Okay,
but I know
some-
Manong.
Well, no, yeah.
Yeah.
But I mean, I
No,
think
but
like,
there was there was a Manong presence here, and
Oh, yeah.
Yes.
okay, I did not know that. Well, there I go. I feel like I'm contributing to that history.
Yes, you are, Kennedy.
And I think as we've learned through just doing this podcast and hearing people's stories about their communities and places that are very far flung and not quite like LA, just this connection that like, on one hand, like we're always going to create like kind of a new sense of like what the new Filipino American kind of like identity and community is, but also like it comes with like understanding that like, as Allison mentioned when we talked to her, like this is also formerly Tongva land, this is like still their land and their history and
Yeah, there's
the connections to like,
the original native
peoples,
populations.
Yeah, and even like as we live in historic Filipino town, and if people came to historic Filipino town today and it's like, well, where are the Filipinos at? But I mean, like it's like
We're right here.
we come up with these kind of identities and markers, and like there is kind of like this groundswell of like certain kind of like histories and communities in certain places. But yeah, in a place like Los Angeles, I mean, it's like it's always in flux, always kind of changing,
Yes.
and like
Yes.
we've always kind of found different places to kind of build community in different ways. And I think as we're kind of picking up on throughout these conversations, like Little Tokyo just happens to be really kind of the hub of Asian American community for so many different reasons. So
So, we did a rapid fire session with Allison. So we're going to
crap.
do a rapid fire session with you.
yeah, you're gonna do it.
Don't worry about it.
I'm
It's no pressure. It's okay.
I didn't get much sleep last night. I'm gonna be in trouble.
Okay, go.
Okay, first question. What is your favorite place to get sweets in Little Tokyo?
Oh, in Little Tokyo, favorite place to get sweets. Oh, geez, there's a new place called Donatsu. They have vegan donuts, and you wouldn't know it if they didn't tell me it was vegan donuts. I would have believed it wasn't. I mean, I wouldn't have thought anything. There's really good sweet donuts. Where else in Little Tokyo? God, well, there's also always Fugetsu though.
Yeah, I was gonna say
Because they have really good,
mochi.
Yeah.
Favorite lunch spot?
In Little Tokyo or anywhere?
Oh, Little Tokyo.
Yeah.
Okay. Jeez, okay, again, there could be, I'm going to say Dulce, Cafe Dulce. I'm going to say, because I go there a lot. What
do you get?
So I get their, is it the club sandwich? The thing is, they like, they have a nice spicy spread on theirs. I'm kind of not good with spices, but I can handle theirs, so yeah. I'll go there. Or okay, I would say either there or there really are so many Little Tokyo. Okay, so Cafe
Go to
Dulce.
list, yes.
Spitz, which is Mediterranean inspired, like wraps and sandwiches. They have
Like gyros and
wraps and,
falafel.
donors and gyros, yeah. And then if I want to go old school, there's a new place called Prime Pizza, which is
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
That's really
thin
good pizza.
crust New York pizza. It's like crispy, crunchy, crisp. So I can't pick one, but those are my three go-tos for lunch.
Nice. If somebody was visiting Little Tokyo for the first time, or you were introducing someone to Little Tokyo for the first time, where was probably the first or second place you would take them?
Oh, jeez. Oh, man. I think I would take him. I would take him to one of the. I guess I'd take him to JVC Plaza, the Central Plaza in Little Tokyo, with the big fire tower. Just because there's a lot of restaurants there, very Japanese authentic restaurants there, and I'd start there. But then I'd probably take him to Suihiro because that's such a L.A., such a Los Angeles, a Los Angeles Little Tokyo place. Suihiro's restaurant, which is open till like midnight or 2 a.m. sometimes.
I think it's like 2 a.m. because I have totally got there after. After.
All right. So, any final thoughts? Anything that you're working on next, or
No, nothing specific. Just I'm teaching at the studio that I teach at, and just.
Do you want to share that?
Oh, sure.
I'd like to. If folks want to learn circus from you, where should they go?
I teach here in LA at a place called Kinetic Theory Circus Arts in Los Angeles. It's a pretty big studio, pretty high ceilings, and we have a nice, pretty big facility. So if you want to learn, I teach beginning aerial arts. So if you're a beginner, don't be scared. You don't have to have any upper body strength. Everyone says, I don't have any upper body strength. Well, no one has because it's a beginning class, so don't worry. And some people say I'm too old. Well, I taught people who are in their 70s. So,
ooh, let's take the class, Mike.
Yeah,
nope.
People in there.
I am definitely scared of heights, and I.
So yeah, no real excuse. I've even taught a woman who was an amputee. She had one of her legs was amputated, so I taught her. So what's your excuse now, huh?
Well, thank you for sitting down with us and talking about the neighborhood, and I really appreciate it.
Yes, thank you, Kennedy.
Thank you for having me on.
We're here in visual communications to talk with
Francis Collyer.
And Francis, what is your role here at Visual Communications?
I am the executive director of visual communications.
And how long has it been since you've been here?
I've been here as director, or just been here?
I guess both. I mean, that's kind of the thing I've been digging into. Is just like
director since end of 2014, but I've been here with the festival since 2010. I took a short break in the middle in 2014 to work at SEPA. But I started here at VC as an intern in 2002.
Wow. Yeah. Okay. So
but it hasn't been that continual since 2002.
No, but it's 17 years ago. I mean, even if I think about my connections to visual communications and Little Tokyo in general, I mean, it probably goes back about that as far back too, a little bit. So how would you describe visual communications to anybody who has no knowledge about this place at all?
We're a media arts center, been around since 1970. Our mission is to develop, support Asian Americans and Pacific Islander filmmakers and media artists, most importantly, who empower communities and challenge perspectives. Simply, we weaponize filmmaking.
Wow.
In terms of its power, what it means, who tells those stories and how they tell those stories in the communities that those stories reflect. So yeah.
And the biggest program being the festival that happens every year.
The biggest program, we're known for the Los Angeles Asian Pacific Film Festival going on its 35th year. But, media arts encompasses not just film, but photography, audio makers, image makers. So we support a bunch of folks across the board.
And actually, at the time of this recording, it's only in a couple weeks, maybe a few months from now, right?
Yeah. So next month, May.
Oh, wow.
May 2nd, opening night, film festival.
Yeah, and this Filipino American Life has always been, a partner in some way or another. Elaine has been, part of the team helping put on, the festival in different ways. So it's, definitely something that we feel like have always been connected to in some way or another.
Right.
And I mean, I think, one of the things that we always try to look for when we come to the festival is it's a representation of Filipino Americans and that. And I think, and you're Filipino American.
Right.
Right. And so, as I've been digging into kind of the history of this neighborhood and the history of Filipino American connections to it, a name that has continually popped up over and over again was one of the founders of this space, Linda Mabalot, right?
Yeah. Linda was our executive director for a very long time, and she passed away in 2003. She was actually the first person I've met here at VC when my first time in Little Tokyo actually to come here in front, park in the front of the courtyard, walk around through the back, and there's a woman with a raspy voice smoking and going, "How's it?" And I'm turning my application to be an intern here, and she was sort of at that point of my sort of identity politics, or even or building that or constructing it. She sort of amazed me because I've always thought Filipinos that age came from the Philippines, and she's actually my dad's age, right? And just to find out that she grew up in the Sacramento Delta, right? And sort of that's sort of the first time I got exposed live. And then, long story short, because of my experience here at VC, I switched my major to Asian American Studies just to sort of understand what this means. For a very long time, our legal name here was Southern California Asian American Studies Central. We was, intently we were the media arm of the Asian American movement.
Really? Okay. I didn't really know that part of that history. Yeah. Did you even know Linda before you even came here? Did you heard about her in any way?
No.
Or how did you even hear about like this space, I guess?
I was not an intern, but college aide for a guy named Steve Nagano, who's a stalwart in this community, and I met him in 2000. A couple of years later, he's like, "You should need to apply for this," and he's been working on with stuff like NCRR, all the different sort of Japanese American civil rights movement that he's been part of, and VC itself has a core history of Japanese Americans with our founders and another Chinese American, but we're strongly rooted as well in our Filipino American experience and culture here.
One of the things we talked about with someone we talked to earlier, Kennedy, was just kind of like, how this space, Kennedy and Allison actually talking about how Little Tokyo, which is where visual communication sits, has been kind of that nexus or the kind of meeting point for a lot of folks across the Asian American kind of diaspora, right? How much of that kind of feeds into the history of this space?
A lot. When we moved into the space, we're here at the Union Center for the Arts. Upstairs is East West Players. Up front is Art Core. As everybody knows, the courtyard is Tuesday Night Cafe, right? And so it's always been this performative space or just space of creativity that brings communities together. And not necessarily, there's different layers and intersections of Japanese Americans, Asian Americans, Angelinos, just artists in general that have sort of come through these spaces. I consider this district, it's an arts and cultural district, as well as rooted in history.
Yeah.
And so, and I always feel that this is sort of that creativity nexus for a lot of folks, and I extend that all the way to academics, to musicians, to filmmakers, to just folks interested in the arts and want to experience that.
So, you're originally from the South Bay, right?
I grew up in Long Beach, but I was born in Bataan. I came here in 1988, Long Beach, because my dad was in the Navy. He was stationed there at the Naval Hospital at the time. And went to Cal State Long Beach, and I currently live in the border of Lakewood. So,
but I mean, I guess the South Bay of LA being also, for folks not familiar with, Los Angeles geography, the South Bay being, and also kind of like this kind of space in which a lot of Asian Americans from kind of different backgrounds are all kind of in the same space. It's kind of, especially in like,
I would say so, but I feel like, we're still sort of segregated by ethnic enclaves. I mean, Long Beach itself, West Long Beach, you can say that's Filipinos going to like Carson side, but it's also Samoans and Tongans and Pacific Islanders. But you also have Long Beach, where we have a core community of Khmer Americans or Cambodians, but also other Southeast Asians, but Latinos, African American. So it's sort of a little, it's a good little world, I think, coming from there.
Yeah, and the reason I keep digging into this is because one of the things we've been finding out as we've been doing this podcast is that, number one, we've never like proclaimed that the Filipino American experience is like a monolithic thing, right? I mean, people have very different experiences. People in the Midwest will not experience the same things as we do out here. But one of the most interesting facets and the reasons we started talking to folks about Little Tokyo and kind of our connection as a Filipino American community is the fact that like, a lot of times, we're always kind of looking for these spaces in which we can come together. And sometimes I think of visual communications as one of those spaces in which like it just seems to kind of continue to happen and thrive and things like that. But also like knowing that there isn't a lot of spaces for like at least up until only recently, maybe like for Filipino American voices in particular. Because I mean, like, was there like I think it was only recently that we have like a Filipino American film festival, right? Or like,
right.
So things like that. Right. But yeah, so you found out through this person. What was his name again?
Steve Nagano.
About visual communications. You came here, did an internship. What was it like back then?
I mean, God, what was it like back then? I think that was sort of the advent of everybody trying to use email, right? And so our modes of working was still sort of live calls and maybe even hard letters, right? With a little bit of email. So I just sort of remember that was really my first job. I had to use email. And you can just sort of imagine. And now we're sort of just stuck in email world all day long, and that's sort of our virtual communication tool. But we did the same thing. So I interned over the summer, and we used to do this thing called Chilivisions. It stopped because after Linda passed, and we the organization shifted to doing other live events. But Chilivisions was, if you imagine, a community chili cook-off contest. So you have folks here in Little Tokyo participating, like Little Tokyo Service Center, the museum, the cultural center, all the way to folks at ADAP. I think folks at SIPA and other folks in historic Filipino town would participate as well. So it was all these nonprofits coming together, and it was a chili cooking contest.
It's funny. I always wondered why. I think because I saw one of the last setups of that, maybe at like, there was like a little offshoot thing that was set up at a FPAC, the Festival of Filipino Arts and Culture. There was like a tent or something at one point.
Right.
That I think Abe Ferreira was kind of managing.
Well, I think, NVC was part with Abe. We used to curate kind of these Friday night filmmaker things before, the Saturday kickoff of FPAC. But, those nights sometimes would like be really cold at point for Amin, right? And, it's sort of shaking. But, so but you sort of we mentioned Abe Ferreira as well. Another person here is Filipino American. I grew up in Carson and Norwalk, here in Los Angeles, and sort of that's a different Filipino American experience as well, generationally and geography. But
I think one of those things I didn't really quite appreciate until maybe like recently. I think there was like some exhibit or something up, which was all these archival photos of Linda Mabala, even Abe, kind of like in the early kind of 80s, late 70s, maybe Asian American movement kind of stuff. A lot of it, out here, or maybe even parts of like what eventually became historic Filipino town, kind of like, and again, for those not familiar with the geography of the city, like it's basically, we're only like 2 neighborhoods over from where Filipino town is. But you eventually left there and you ended up at SIPA at some point, right? Which is also where I worked at one point in my life too.
I think for me, my exposure was, doing the internship here, you get exposed because of Chili Vision to all these other community organizations you don't really necessarily know about, being in the bubble of Long Beach.
Yeah.
I mean, you come up here and sort of, folks like John Eric because of his parties in the 90s and things like that, right? But it was sort of still, it's a far drive for a kid, but you get exposed to I remember also meeting an intern who was working at SIPA, but also became one of the organizers for FPAC that year. And so I learned about SIPA, I learned about FPAC, and to be forward, it's like I've always wanted to work at these places and sort of try it out and things. And for a while, I was part of some core organizations coming out of Cal State Long Beach to do like haunted nights, Halloweens at SIPA, and how to set up a maze. So I was, and then obviously, the Veterans March and all those things. And that was sort of that time in early 2000s to, friendship games to, right.
There's so many pieces
to Cal Poly Pomona's, sports fest, and then it's sort of these kind of. It was also my own college experience.
Yeah.
Right? But you get exposed. I worked at SEPA, and sort of one of those things I always wanted to try my hands in not necessarily health and human services, but in family services, and what does it mean to help not just Filipino Americans in the neighborhood, but everybody in that neighborhood.
Yeah, and Search to Involve Filipino Americans is like right at the western edge of historic Filipino town. It's actually the street where me and Elaine live on, and I'm also a former employee of SEPA. LA is kind of full of all these different kind of ethnic enclaves. A lot of different Asian American ones. You have a Thai town, a Korea town, we have a Filipino town. But I mean, had you really kind of experienced Filipino town, much prior to that, I guess?
Not through only through sort of volunteering for those organizations, and I mean the best way to actually experience is walking in, and if you ever done the march,
the Veterans March, right?
You've sort of walked it all the way to through the monuments and the parks, Lake Street, and all these different things, and learning about, and obviously the mural as well. I think the biggest difference I've always sort of put it with Hi-Fi and Little Tokyo. Hi-Fi is so spread out, and here in Little Tokyo, everybody can just walk together, and by even walking creates that community of just seeing each other right away. Mm-hmm. Versus, I might work at, SEPA, somebody would be at FOSG. It's still have to work together still requires a drive, not just. And I think that's sort of the wonderful magic of Little Tokyo, because then we'll just bump into each other going to lunch, getting a drink after work, Tuesday night cafe.
Yeah.
So there's sort of just this physical geography of people that tends to let people coalesce a little bit, I think.
Yeah, I mean,
deeper.
And you mentioned Tuesday Night Cafe, which probably has been brought up a couple times now in this podcast, but Tuesday Night Cafe is a performing arts open mic space centered around the Asian American kind of experience that happens in the courtyard in front of the theater, under which where the theater under which visual communications exist. So yeah, I mean, it's something that's literally like you come out the door on a Tuesday, first and third Tuesday in the spring and summer, and you're in the middle of like this space that for the longest time had a lot of also Filipino Americans kind of like helping produce that show, hosting. John Eric of the Parks Finest was, one of the main hosts for a long time. And I thought about it too when I was part of that team and we brought it to SEPA for a show or two just to kind of try that out. Very different vibe. I mean, it's a very different space, like just the neighborhood, right?
Right.
It felt like, we couldn't really kind of just have, I mean, this is not necessarily like it was a detrimental experience anyway. It was just a very different experience.
Yeah.
And I think like to your point, just kind of the vibe of people kind of just coming by it, encountering Tuesday Night Cafe almost by accident sometimes really kind of adds to the flavor of that space, right?
Right. And I think that's sort of neighborhoods and different urban, you can sort of, Hi-Fi is a little bit more suburbic in a way versus like more urban, and can say in terms of just being right next to work areas. I don't know, not necessarily see Hi-Fi as a lot of industrial or commercial work areas, or but but I also see as a lot of people live there as their homes.
Yeah.
Right. And while we do have a lot of people that live in Little Tokyo as their homes with in these buildings, a lot of people travel out of here too.
Yeah. They're very different neighborhoods. Yeah. And we also touch on kind of with a couple of conversations about how, this was one of the original kind of spots in which Filipinos landed too, like way back in the day.
And for me, Little Tokyo actually feels like, with Kennedy, with Allison and Kat, who used to work upstairs, Kat Carrito. There's a lot of folks working in Little Tokyo, and they're all in the creative spaces. And I also want to mention somebody like Jilly, right,
Kind of
arts, and sort of been sort of responsible to create the current leaders of Filipino American community in arts and culture. But it's always been the home. I can sort of imagine, close my eyes, our manongs here walking through just couple of blocks away, from a taxi dance hall,
or Bunker Hill,
or maybe a boxing fight, right? And it's just all so close together, and it's not it's like I mentioned earlier, people probably walking all the way from Main Street and probably all the way to to Chinatown, where currently is Union Station, right? It's not that bad of a walk. I think people were doing it, and you just imagine this vibrant downtown of people of color that couldn't live anywhere else, right?
Yeah.
But also a migrant bachelor society. So I can sort of imagine that, and even one of the books, one of my professors, Linda Marum, when she was sort of talking about downtown LA and sort of a center for masculinity for Filipinos through taxi dances on boxing. Weller Court right now, that used to be sort of part of this block of Filipinos. It
was brought up previously, but I think it was like the legend is that Carlos Bolosan even stayed there one time.
Right.
I haven't found anyone yet who's fully confirmed that.
Right.
I think it actually used to be part of the tours. Well, maybe it's still part of the tours that I know Filipino Worker Center does with their jeepney. They'll talk about that. And we were trying to figure out, maybe we'll figure this out later, if Uncle Roy had that part of his kind of tours of like Filipino town and talked about that, because I knew it also included kind of Little Tokyo and Bunker Hill as part of that narrative.
So I feel it. I can imagine, folks not, coming back to LA after seasons are done on the farms or the canneries, and it felt it, and I think just part of just how LA became and segregated, but also just the redlinings and all those things, eventually we moved to hi-fi, right? But, but also I think signaled the move to sort of live in bigger spaces, maybe in a bigger house versus the sort of density here. And I'm just imagining here in downtown, or more of the transient part of downtown versus I think, homes and hi-fi. But I feel it here. I think, and I think part of it too, I always just sometimes think, maybe Japanese American culture of, motanai, of not wasting anything, or sort of all these different cultural behaviors, how that aligns sort of with our Filipino behaviors of utang na loob and debt and reciprocity, right? And sort of just, which I think sort of intersects well if you imagine just core group of Filipinos sometimes just supposing in Little Tokyo, how does that happen? Here? But yeah, so those are some things I've thought about and how we're here. But I feel, and it's everybody, and it's just not just sort of JAs and Filipinos and Chinese Americans, and but also Bronzeville, African Americans, and
during the war
here. And so it's been this vibrant space, and while I think it's been a home for Japanese American and symbolically, but it's been a home for everybody. And I hope it continues a home for everybody. How you mentioned it's going to be a nexus for the future.
Yeah. I mean, I think one of the things that has been coming up a lot lately, for better or for worse, is because of kind of the rise in kind of the visibility of things like Filipino American cuisine, Filipino American kind of like creative folks, whether on TV or on stage or whatever it is. This question about like, where is the Filipino American community, especially in a place like LA, which has like the largest, I think, population, if not, because you look at like something like a Little Tokyo where it's very visible, very commercial, a Koreatown, which kind of like felt like it almost sprung up out of nowhere in the early 90s, and now it's like huge and like this nexus also. And then you look at Filipino Town, which was, granted its name like officially like in the early 2000s, right?
Right.
And only maybe recently could you say that there was a lot of things starting to kind of happen, at least in the visible way, right? But the other thing you could also argue is that like, the concentrations of like Koreans in Koreatown doesn't match like the concentrations of Filipinos in Filipino Town or something like that, right?
Yeah.
But just this idea of like, what is our spaces and like the sustainability of being able to create something like a visual communications, right, anywhere else,
Right. Well, I think we're just sort of lucky with Linda thinking about finding us a home, because from there, before that, we moved around too, right? But in terms of sort of hi-fi and sort of other communities of or what I consider Filipino centers. We're all over.
Yeah.
And I think that was sort of when people found out the designation for historic Filipino towns, like, well, I live in Carson. Isn't this Filipino town?
Yeah.
I live in Cerritos. I live in Artesia.
Is that Glendale Filipino town or Eagle Rock or
and it's also, but that's also, I think, just a reflection of LA.
yeah.
Let's just say if I put on a Filipino American Film Festival where I put it, because I know Glendale Filipinos might necessarily drive to Cerritos,
Yeah,
right,
yeah.
and vice versa. And so how do you do that? And I think even for Film Arts or for FPAC, that was sort of okay. Where do you sort of create this center for a weekend for Filipinos to come over, right? Which I feel like it's different versus maybe Daly City. You can sort of say
Or National City.
there's sort of a core there, or Jersey City or something like that. And at the same time, I think we're still replenishing first generation Filipino Americans. And where do they move to, right?
Yeah.
Is it hi-fi? If it was just say maybe when you couldn't live anywhere else?
Yeah.
And that's also a factor of socioeconomic of what money you're bringing here. If you can live in West Covina versus you have to live in all intents and purposes of Carson or historic Filipino town, right? And,
Yeah.
So I think part of it's a reflection of suburbanization of Filipinos in a way.
Yeah. Yeah.
But so yeah, I think that's always been a challenge. But and the challenge because of these spaces is how do we actually do things together and be quote unquote united for some of the things that we're doing, right? So but to each his own, and I've been to very parts of Cerritos with their Chamber of Commerce doing wonderful stuff. Same thing in Carson, but same thing in Glendale. But but it all reflects this core process of making our community how hyper local it is to be better and reflective of ourselves.
Yeah. And so maybe at the end of the day, like, the point is that ethnic enclaves are kind of almost besides the point at this juncture, kind of in our community's kind of development as a community as it is. Because I think a lot of times we think of like these ethnic enclaves as like an opportunity for like community building, community growth, but I think as you just kind of laid out, like it happens in its own kind of way, in its own kind of spaces, in different ways, and only like ways that are like make sense to those communities themselves, right?
But historic Filipino is very important because that's a physical symbolism for people, for us, right? But we can also imagine our communities too, right? In terms of virtual and how we think of ourselves, and for me, it's crazy how you sort of imagine it. I mean, 20 years ago, 25 years ago, my Filipino American identity of this community just encompasses West Long Beach and maybe Carson. And then how do you sort of make yourself or differentiate yourself from the other Filipinos in like Oxnard, right?
Yeah.
And sort of kind of like, you're right. And it's like, oh, he's a NorCal Filipino. That's a Northern Filipino. And that's a Riverside Filipino.
A whole nother episode could be devoted to like, okay, what is a West Covina Filipino versus a Cerritos Filipino?
But fast forward 20, 25 years later, where there was sort of this Facebook, you can imagine more of a global community. Not even just a Filipino American community, thinking now I'm not so different from the Filipino Americans that grew up in Brooklyn, right? Like we sort of like, and that's sort of the power of, I think, of media to sort of create those symbolism of or how we can imagine, like kind of Benedict Anderson type of like, we need these symbols, but we don't know all the Filipinos in the world, but we sort of can imagine sort of a desired connection to things, but so it sort of behooves me sometimes like to think, what is my daughter going to think of it? What is that identity politics, right?
Are you even teaching her Tagalog or anything like that?
Well, I think we'll try to get into their Filipino cultural school, right, and things like that, but and she, she spends most of their time in Carson, so she's sort of she's Filipino, but what is that sort of impetus to search for your identity, right? As a third generation now, as a fourth generation versus that coming from your parents, first and second, or me, 1.5, or what did that mean for me?
I mean, even to your point earlier about Linda, like having grown up in the Sacramento Delta and something that you hadn't really quite experienced, like at least until at that point,
Right.
that there were Filipinos who are like generations deep here. And I think the thing that I'm also kind of, kind of learning kind of through all these conversations about Little Tokyo and its connections to Filipinos is that like, when we think of these communities and these enclaves, I mean, a lot of times they were there to kind of serve the 1.5, 2 second generation to kind of help them kind of, lay a foundation for building out their families and communities and whatnot. But I think as a Filipino American identity really matures, I mean, again, like a Filipino town, to your point, is a critical kind of symbol in a lot of ways, was an opportunity for us to kind of demonstrate our presence and our power. But also we've been able to thrive without that. Because we're creating something that's completely different from like, what those early generations were trying to build. Even if you think about Little Tokyo and the reason Little Tokyo exists, and like, if you talk about the, this generation of Japanese Americans, like they see it as like this place, but like, I wouldn't say that they necessarily like work here, live here. They build their communities where they live, right?
It's still a cultural center to come back to, right? In terms of
it's like a home base
week and things like that. Mm-hmm. And for us, I don't think my parents has ever been. They live in Long Beach. I don't think they've ever been to historic Filipino town, except that time we took them to the Parks Finest, right? It's sort of like, okay, there's dollar hits. It was like, well, I can just get it down the street too, and on Santa Fe. But but it's sort of that. But but for the next generation, if we take our children to a march, if you take them to the mural and see that, it sort of gives them there's power in that. Just saying now, like, wow, I there's something says Filipino on something versus imagine where I'm sort of just a transient around, right? In the 20s, 30s, or 40s. And conversely, I hope that this subsequent generations appreciate that, and understand that what the importance of it, and if the designation or something ever has to be fought a couple of years, I hope a new generation of Filipino Americans are willing to stand up for that.
Yeah. So after having worked here for so many years, what is your favorite part of Little Tokyo?
I think it depends.
Like food wise, or just like a place you like relax.
Yeah,
or,
I mean, I've always sort of like going out the door and just going outside and catching a segment of Tuesday Night Cafe, with a beer in my hand or a whiskey in my hand. But Far Bar's always been one of those places for me, or Sojitos or Cafe Dulce as well. So these are sort of businesses, but I also tied those businesses to sort of personal experiences. But just walking around, I would say I have a different preferred space. Depends on my mood for the day. Whether you're just sort of hanging out with people and things like that. I mean, Far Bar is always going to be special, and it's been special for a lot of folks. And for Far East Cafe, for birthdays, even funerals. That's where me and my wife had our wedding shower. That's where I also had my 30th birthday a long time ago. And college, you go to Oiwake's. And
there used to be Wylands back in the day.
Right, and you can get your $2 fries and a dollar beer. So I think that was sort of the thing too. In 20 years ago, it's really college friendly in regards to budget. I just sort of remember coming here. I can afford it. I don't know if I can afford Little Tokyo, to be honest, on a college budget.
I couldn't live here if I wanted to.
Right.
Maybe 20 years ago, maybe.
But to just go out for a night, right?
And I mean, that speaks to the strength and the growth of this community in general, but also that, like, as it changes, considering, it still will be a nexus, but like a nexus for what, I suppose.
Right. And, and just, God, I love the vibrancy here just on on a Friday night, on a Saturday night, but only just Saturday during the day. People are visiting the museum. There's events at the cultural center. Arthur Nakane is... singing his thing in the
world
plaza, right? It's just sort of vibrant that way. My favorite part of Little Tokyo, actually, or the time, is Sunday mornings. Right after sort of the sun peaks out. don't ask me why I'm doing it Sunday mornings, but there's sometimes I have to be early Sunday mornings. But the pavement's just freshly washed, and there's something serene about Little Tokyo in downtown because the cars aren't here yet, the people aren't here yet, but, and there's a freshness to the air, and so. If you ever get a chance to just see Sunday morning, like 7 a.m. Little Tokyo, I feel like it's beautiful.
That's beautiful. So I guess where would you take somebody who was maybe visiting here for the first time? Where would you tell them to go, or what would you show them if they were just kind of laying eyes on this neighborhood?
I would sort of do that Little Tokyo tour of the spine, coming from here at Union Center for the Arts, going up San Pedro, Iso Street to the Cultural Center, and then going down the spine of JVP and ending up at the museum and the Gopher Brook Monument. And then, on the way looking at the mural as well in Central. And part of that is I've been doing those tours recently just for a few folks, and then it's just wonderful to sort of bump into so many people, along the way when you're doing that on a Monday at 10 a.m.
Yeah.
People live here, people work here. They're also business owners. I'm privileged enough to be part of the Little Tokyo Community Council board with a bunch of business owners here in Little Tokyo, but community workers. And so yeah, I just walk around and just show these little places. And even the stories, okay, this is where the store is, where, a man came in and then grabbed the sword and started wielding it around. And now because of that,
the sword's not out there anymore.
The sword's not out there anymore. But I was sort of amazed during that day because I was sort of, that was the time I think cops were just shooting everybody.
Oh, geez.
And there was a guy wielding the sword, and then the cops were sort of not had patience to sort of calm him down and not to sort of escalate the situation.
Yeah, in a sad way, that was a good day then.
Right. But it's like, oh, they don't have the samurai sword there right there displayed anymore because of that.
Yeah.
But or this is where things, and I used to remember this place called LA Chicken or La Chicken.
Yeah, right on First Street, right? Yeah,
it's not there anymore. That was sort of one
next
of the
to Red Wings
places.
or something, right? Yeah,
cheapest places to eat and get. You can get a quote unquote Japanese taco or Japanese burrito, but for
what a great metaphor for this neighborhood.
right.
Japanese taco,
and it had a sign that says "Chicken tastes like Lexus." But it was sort of like a Japanese El Pollo Loco, and it was really, you get this burrito with coleslaw in there, and it was amazing. And they're also the same owner of the Family Mart.
Oh, okay.
Okay.
But
they sort of closed down, and now it's just I think Bento Man over there. But when I was an intern in 2002, Senor Fish used to be in the old Atomic Cafe over there where Wayland's was, and to get that burrito over there too. But I remember there used to be sort of like this deli counter in the basement of where the California Bank and Trust building is right now. The guy, you had to come in early. The guy would, have homemade chili or homemade stew, and you just sort of would buy it from him. And one day he was one of those characters, right?
Yeah.
Kind of like Little Tokyo characters like Grace, right? Grace Shikui and all these.
Who lives just around like the building next door, basically.
And I think that's sort of what makes Little Tokyo wonderful, the people that actually live here, and kind of they live here, they work here, they breathe in, they breathe out. So the buildings are not faceless.
Yeah,
they're attached to physical people as it is now, as it was decades ago.
Yeah. Well, thank you for taking the time to talk.
Oh, that's a good conversation.
Yeah.
Man. Thanks.
And I mean, if there's any other kind of thoughts or anything you want people to know about, we have the festival that's coming up, right? Again?
Yeah, Los Angeles Asian Pacific Film Festival. We're going super Filipino this year. I think by this point we've embargoed a lot, so we're opening with Diane Paraga's Yellow Rose.
Oh,
stars Eva Noblezada and Leia Salonga in there.
Oh, the Queen.
Yeah, and we're closing our film festival with Andrea Walters' Empty by Design. So it's a bookend by really strong Filipinas. For the film festival, and we're doing a bunch of stuff in the middle too.
It's beautiful.
So.
Great, excited. You'll definitely be there, and you'll probably find out more about this festival. And this episode will actually probably come out right before the festival launches. And so, definitely look out for things on this Filipino American Life social media about it. Come by the festival to even hang out with us. Who knows? Maybe you'll get to take a picture with Francis. So, but thank you again, Francis, for talking with us. And, take care.
All right.
This Filipino American Life is produced by Michael Nailat. Our intro and outro music is by Roger Habon, aka 10.4 Raj. Resident reality checker Girly Colado, legal advisor Rianne Fajardo, and graphic design by Vincent Collyer.